Like I mentioned in the last video, I've been spending most of my time recently working on new 3D elements. I just finished a new brig model, so I'll probably be back in Master and Commander with the Sophie for the next few scenes. I'll be working on that next, but I wanted to try out a shorter scene just to test out how my computer handled the more detailed model as I was creating and rendering the sequence. So for this video, I'll be giving a brief explanation of the weather gauge, at least as I understand it based on my reading. I mainly referenced the Wikipedia page and a particularly helpful post on the Aubrey Maturin series subreddit, both of which I've linked in the description. Thank you to all the posters there. I feel like I'd be in the dark on a lot of the series details without the insights of more knowledgeable readers sharing on public forums. As another update, I've been sort of reconsidering the use of audiobook excerpts in these videos in terms of copyright. Not that I've run into trouble yet. Initially, I felt the videos could be considered fair use, given that they add original content to only specific sections of the books. But while I still think that, I understand a bit better now that that wouldn't necessarily prevent a copyright strike. That said, I'm considering how I might change the format to avoid using the audiobooks in the future. I wouldn't necessarily make that change immediately. I'd want to see how I could fill that void in other ways and experiment a bit, but it's something I'd like to start thinking about. I feel a bit bad suggesting a change to the format you all have enjoyed so far, but I'd aim to find other ways to make the videos engaging, and hopefully they'd be safer from copyright issues. Definitely feel free to leave any comments or questions about that though. But with that aside, I'll go ahead and get into the video. The weather gauge refers to the tactical advantage a ship holds when positioned upwind of its opponent in an engagement. For this demonstration, we'll assume we have two ships of equal size, speed, and gunnery, both lying perpendicular to a west wind, and one directly upwind of the other. There are other variables I'll briefly mention in passing, like whether there's land nearby or other ships involved, but to keep it simple, this will be a single ship action in open water. To show the available directions the ships can sail, I'll use these visual aids. The darkest sector is the no-sail zone, through which neither ship can progress apart from during tacking. The gray and red sectors are close-hauled, and I'll explain the colors a bit more later. And the white area is any direction with the wind abaft the beam. I'll also be using these zones to indicate the range of each ship's guns. Not necessarily the extreme range, but more the area within which we'd consider the ships to be decisively engaged. The ranges are also not to scale. We'll start with the act of engaging, separating it into two cases. One where the windward ship engages, and one where the leeward ship engages. In order for the windward ship to engage, the easiest route is to simply bear up and head straight downwind until she's brought the leeward ship in range. One thing you might note is that as she approaches the leeward ship, she's more vulnerable to a raking broadside. Here's where the advantage of the weather gauge would come into play. Though simply occupying the upwind position can't protect her from a broadside, it does give her many more options to choose her course. At any moment, she could haul her wind to bring her starboard broadside to bear. She could wear and head south to avoid fire and bring her larboard broadside to bear, or ultimately even cross the enemy's stern. Or she could use some combination of maneuvers to simply make her movement more difficult to predict. The essential advantage is that there's no point of sail that's inaccessible to her as she progresses toward the leeward ship, so she has far more options for how to do so in the way best suited to her particular sailing qualities and the skill of her crew. In order for the leeward ship to engage, she would necessarily have to beat upwind. Sailing close-hauled is inherently more difficult than sailing before the wind. The trim of the sails, position of the helm, and rotation of the yards have to be skillfully balanced to avoid luffing and losing thrust. If this does happen, whether by accident or while tacking, the leeward ship risks becoming a sitting duck, lacking the steerage way to quickly evade the windward ship's broadsides. As a result, her path is much more predictable, as she can really only close by heading west of north in this case. Otherwise, she could only run downwind or wear to delay combat for a more favorable scenario. This is why the close-hauled zone is red instead of gray for the leeward ship, because while it is a riskier point of sail for both, it puts her at an unconditional disadvantage if she's attempting to close the gap herself. This is also why it's generally said that the ship with the weather gauge initiates the engagement. Once the two ships are actively engaged, the weather gauge continues to play a role. As the guns fire, the smoke drifts to leeward. This means that as the engagement progresses, the vision of the leeward gun crews is obstructed by both their own broadside smoke and by that of the windward ship. This effect is much more pronounced in line of battle actions, though. Another thing to note is that the ships will heel to leeward. For both ships, this causes the leeward guns to point more downward, while the windward guns point more upward. And when the angle of heel is significant, the lower deck gun ports on the leeward side may need to be shut to avoid flooding. Overall, I imagine the advantage comparison is a bit of a wash between the windward and leeward ships. The leeward ship's guns may have more range because of the higher tilt, but the windward ship's range is also slightly increased by the following wind. The windward ship may lose her lower guns, but the leeward ship's hull will be more exposed to hits below the waterline that might eventually cause flooding. And either ship has the ability to trim sail to reduce the angle of heel. For disengaging, most of the same conditions apply as for engaging, just in reverse. If the windward ship chooses to disengage, she has to sail upwind, which is of course more difficult. It may be the case that the powder smoke obscures her enough for her to make her escape, but this is typically seen as one of the few disadvantages of the weather gauge. The leeward ship would of course have more freedom to disengage, as she'd only need to bear up and head downwind. Again, sailing downwind requires less attention and active sail management, and is faster, so the leeward ship does have the advantage for disengaging. There are a lot of other factors that can tip the scales one way or another. The number and strength of the vessels involved, whether there's a shore to windward or leeward, and the overall weather conditions can all add complexity. But my understanding is that on average, the ship with the weather gauge holds the tactical advantage, not necessarily in every scenario, but in the sense that she has the most control to choose the scenario that suits her best.